Thanks for tuning in for this installment of Black and Bold Perspectives on Leadership. I'm Makiyah Moody, and today I have the pleasure of conversing with Taishya Adams, who's hailing from Boulder, Colorado. Hi, Taishya.
Hello.
It's so good to see you in real time.
Indeed, indeed. Oh, wonderful to see you as well.
Great. So let's just get into some of these questions because I know you have so much to share and offer to this dialogue. So, first question is about this current moment that we're in. For me, 2020 has been a year unlike any other with the global pandemic, the protests from coast to coast, thinking about just the environmental challenges that we're facing as a country and as a world. And there's also this uptick with nonprofits and foundations that are claiming racial equity as this aspiration, actually declaring it. And so I'm wondering, what's been your biggest moment of reckoning as you reflect on 2020?
Thank you for that. I would agree that it has been unlike any other in my lived experience. The biggest moment of reckoning so far for me was really, it feels almost like a cumulative issue. I mean, obviously there's a pandemic. I think one of the biggest opportunities there has been the great pause where we really, as a country, had an opportunity and as a globe to revisit work, production, what does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to have access to the outdoors and green spaces, especially when you're in a quarantine or a space where you're sheltering at home? Really got us revisiting education. I mean, the biggest reckoning is that everything is back on the table. Right. There's so many times that we as organizers, as activists have been told, no, we can't do that because of X, Y, Z. Well, this great pause in my opinion, has really provided us with a rich opportunity to put everything back on the table. And really, I was talking with the wonderful folks over at the 350.org, and, they reminded me about what space did I want to be in? Do I want to be in the resisting space, in the reform space, or in the reimagining space? And I feel like 2020 is offering an opportunity to be in all three of those spaces. There tends to be a hyper focus on spaces 1 and 2 about resisting. So again, you'll see these protests, the voice of the unheard. As we know, you see this continued focus on reform efforts, reforming a system that was never designed for all of us to be in it and thrive, all of us to thrive in the system. But there's not as much on the re-envisioning or reimagining. There's a lot of lip service, but there's not often a lot of time committed. You have like a 1-day retreat once a year to do your mission and vision. But this current moment has, I think, really pushed us to think more about what type of world do we want to live in light of our current circumstances. And that's very exciting, both on the foundation side, the nonprofit side, as well as the governmental agency side.
That's a fascinating, I think, paradigm or frame of reference for me: resisting, reforming, reimagining. Mm-hmm. I will be carrying that through the rest of the week and thinking about how I want to show up and where I want to exert my energy. So speaking of energy, based on your LinkedIn activity, you are a busy woman. There is a lot going on. So how are you spending your time?
Thank you. Yeah. My grandfather was very big on service. He just really instilled in all of us how critical it was to be an active participant in our democracy. Civic engagement is very important, as well as education. And so, I really sit at the intersection of education, health, workforce, and environment. My work at the American Institutes for Research, AIR, is centered around educational equity, really working with state education agencies and school districts across the country as they are reckoning with what does it mean to have equity and to have equitable access, but also what does racial equity mean? So again, there's a lot of opportunities to address the gaps that we've seen in achievement and wealth, et cetera, but also how do we take it to that next level, right? I don't know if you saw that report last week that the wealth gap remains the same as it was since 1950. And so again, it really, those roles at AIR has been around, okay, well, knowing that, how do we, again, create create an evidence base that is inclusive, more inclusive of the communities that are being served in the design, implementation, analysis, and reporting. But then also on the technical assistance side, when we're talking about anti-racism, when we're talking about implicit bias, when we're talking about issues around linguistic competence, it's more than a student-focused or student-centered initiative. It requires all the adults in the entire community where the student is being educated. So, that's really the crux of my work, is on that education space and building bridges internally with AIR, with our health content experts and our workforce and youth development and international development. Again, really trying to strengthen the intersections internally. I also do a lot of service on the civic engagement side with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, where I'm the first Black woman to serve as a commissioner in the commission's history. And there, again, I'm bringing up these issues around, well, one, acknowledging the strengths that those communities play in Colorado around wildlife and our 55 state parks. But also, how can we strengthen beyond a survey or a focus group, Black people and indigenous peoples and, my Asian, Pacific Islanders, et cetera, the Rainbow Coalition in all of the critical life decisions that are being made around water, air, earth, and fire. And the same with my work in volunteerism with Outdoor Afro, which is specific around Black people and connecting Black people to nature, reimagining Blackness in the outdoors, and again, also protecting outdoors. So I think to myself, where are the most important decisions about our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being made? And who is at the decision-making table? That is always my first, that is where I spend most of my work, right? Is trying to either extend this table, re-establish what the table even looks like. Is this a meal that we even want to be having? Are these the most, who decides? When I think about research or when I think about, these policy initiatives that come out, very well-meaning, very well-intentioned. But I always ask, who decided that this was a problem? Who decided that this intervention or program or policy was going to address in a prioritized way as well? So I see, for example, Recreate Responsibly as a big initiative by the outdoor industry. That's great. But that doesn't necessarily specifically address the over-policing by brown and Black people in the outdoors, right? Asking people, it's an ask, it's an invitation, but it's not a right. So how do we, again, that ownership, that collective ownership, and making sure that we have that representation is really where I spend most of my time, whether it be through AIR or Colorado Parks and Wildlife or through my volunteerism with Outdoor Afro. It really comes back to power and reclaiming our space, both, in our history books as well as our current spaces, right? So oftentimes I'm asked, I can't find, we got to diversify our pipeline and there's just not enough. And there's a sense of scarcity and you couple that with a sense of urgency. But then I start, you go in the receipts. Or evidence. I call them the receipts. I go into the receipts and then I see, oh, there's this person, there's this research. I mean, it's there. We've always been here. We've always, and by we, I mean Black people specifically, as well as the others who you don't see in those where the most important decisions are being made. We are there. We have the credentials. We have the expertise. So it is, what I'm trying really to confront, I think, ultimately, and I'm glad that I'm not the only one in this because it really is a Herculean effort, is can we create the will to make the decisions that are needed, that are responsive to not only the evidence base, but the stakeholders who are being directly impacted?
There are so many things that you just said where I'm having visions from previous board service experiences where the mantra is, there's just not enough people of color that are qualified to serve on our board. And it just smacks of such laziness to me to not actually do the work of cultivating meaningful relationships with individuals that have a right to be at the decision-making table. And so I applaud all of the examples that you just lifted up in these different domains through education, health, workforce development, the environment. I think reclaiming our space and our power is definitely something that resonates deeply with me. And so I appreciate the eloquence with which you just laid out what all those things on your LinkedIn channel actually mean and how they connect. So you mentioned your grandfather and service being really important. And I know that work in the social sector is usually grounded in our values and our principles as individuals. Can you think of a time when your values were in tension and how you reconciled that tension or not?
Blackness in the workplace, I think, is where the tension comes into play. And I'm so happy that I can come to this conversation with a concrete example of how that worked in the positive and not in the negative space. Going back to that asset, we spend so much time on the reform. We're not positioned to harness the opportunities of reimagining. And so at the American Institutes for Research, I'm also the chair of the Black Diaspora Employee Resource Group. And, again, when the social unrest and the racial unrest cold again, right? This is not new. We've seen this. We've seen this uprising, the ebb and flow of racial tensions in this country. But when we were cresting a couple of weeks ago again, the Black Diaspora Network, we typically meet on a monthly basis, but we started instilling weekly virtual water cooler meetings, and where we can kind of just come together and decompress. Because what we realize is that sometimes our very well-meaning, high-educated, etc. White staff members will say, "Happy Friday," for example. And it's just like, well, I just watched this video of a man being killed. Like, I'm not having a happy Friday, right? So how do we build the cultural responsiveness and competencies of all of our staff? And that's where that implicit bias training and a lot of work is being done on that area. But also, how do we create safe spaces for our, specific to the Black Diaspora Network, our Black colleagues who are having a unique experience, right? So that they have a place to share. So that was really exciting. And then it built on to having a huge Juneteenth event. So originally it was just going to be us, celebrating as we have years past, but this uprising had allowed us to extend and make it AIR wide. And so we were able to really celebrate and honor Juneteenth in a way that we never had before. And that helped to alleviate some of the tensions that I've had around July 4th. And so as July 4th comes up, it feels like it's in the place where it should always have been, right? Mm-hmm. My ancestors were not free, all of them, in 1776. So I've always had a tension with that day, right? And in the workplace and how it's celebrated and honored and the different programs that are run around it. I mean, I was in a work group and I saw this big call out and the programs around 4th of July. And I came in late to the program, to their planning, of course. Hi, are you doing anything around Juneteenth? Oh, no, we haven't. That's a flag to me. How are you being inclusive? So again, I'm hopefully providing an example of where we were able to alleviate some of those tensions. And again, it's about that power piece, right? I'm elevating Juneteenth as a, in as high of a regard as I can without it being a federal holiday. Hink, hink, wink, 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 nudge, nudge. Into the importance of 4th of July. But again, it's the willingness to acknowledge, the willingness to set aside time. I mean, our CEO made an announcement, set aside time so that our colleagues could participate. It wasn't a sit and get. We had breakout sessions of 5 to 7 of our colleagues, over 150 people participated in our organization virtually. Wow. And then one of the questions that we asked there was, again, it's not enough to just honor and acknowledge. What are you going to do with this new information? And so one of the questions that we had in that breakout session was, now that let's just assume that this is new information, Juneteenth, right? Because even in Black communities, people are like, Juneteenth, what's that about? Right. Prior to the Blackish video. So anyway, when that opportunity came up, we were able to, then say, how does this lost history impact your current work? Right? Because we are working with a lot of Black communities, right? And so how is this information around agency, collective responsibility, et cetera, how does that resonate now that you know? And what other lost history could exist that has significant implications to your work? And so making that commitment. And then my idea is, and I'm going to send a follow up to those small group members and say, hey, you had a chance to talk. Now, I invite you all to reconvene in a month and have that conversation again of how have you then, acknowledge and identify the implications of Juneteenth to your specific project work, particularly if that project work impacts Black people at all, although I would argue that that history is U.S. history and not just United States history and not just the history of Black peoples in the United States. So
Did I hear a microphone? Did I hear a microphone drop? I think I heard a microphone drop in Boulder.
Did my microphone go?
On. No, it strikes me the threading the needle from historic relevance to present day implications, I think is a miss for so many individuals and organizations writ large. Just like the information gaps in how we got to where we are. And there were these design choices that were made, which is why we are where we are. And so back to your point about the reimagining and figuring out the table setting, and if we even want to have a table, it's such a salient, poignant point right now for me as I think about my space in the world. So that was a great example. Thank you. And very timely with that other Independence Day coming up later this week. So you have, I think, alluded to a couple of things related to like your full plate and how you spend your time, where you're investing your energies, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you have an example of when you've had to reclaim your time. So with a shout out to Maxine Waters, who is the mother of reclaiming my time, I'm wondering if you have any examples to lift up related to that context, or how you set boundaries potentially. Maybe it's not about reclaiming time, maybe it's about boundary setting or something in that vein.
So I'm not exactly sure. I have to give some more thought as to why I've always had pretty strong boundaries around making sure I have time for joy. Now remember, if you just give it a little bit of thought, it comes to you. So I started my work with the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School program, and I will never forget when we all convened on Alex Haley's farm in Tennessee. For the training, and all the people were coming from all over the country, and it was really my first time in the education space as a career, and really thinking about it as a career. And one of the sessions was called the Island of Peace, and I remember thinking, there was like multicultural reading strategies, and very specific to the education space because this was summer and after school programs. But then there was this whole what is it called, strand called the Island of Peace. And I was just like, what is this? And essentially what it was there was a yoga class, there was a how to meditate, there was an art class, but the idea was as activists, as those who are really fighting the good fight for our humanity, oftentimes our plates are running low. We, our temple of our body, of our mind, of our spirit, it can get very drained. And so to prevent burnout, they created a strand called the Island of Peace. And that was where we really talked about creating these healthy boundaries and how important it was to create these boundaries. And so it's just been very interesting now that I reflect back on that and realize, oh, right, that's where that came from. Because I have a hard boundary around working at night. I have a hard boundary around working on the weekends. There's exceptions, obviously, to every rule. Proposals tend to be one of them. They always land or fall due on a Monday, or just the complexity of proposal writing tends to necessitate weekends and evenings, as well as networking, etc. But again, it's just been interesting because when I work with my colleagues, that's one of the things that they remark on, that they appreciate that I have boundaries. Like I set time for my lunch break, and I'm very hardcore about it. It's a recurring lunch break every day for an hour, and I'm pretty stingy about that time because, again, I recognize how important it is to have those breaks. And it also goes back to what I was talking about earlier around resist, reframe. No, sorry, resist.
Reform, reimagine.
Resist, reform, and reimagine. And I'll speak for myself, spend so much time on the resist and reform space that I don't have time for reimagine. And I do believe, and it does connect to the podcast I just heard from the good folks at the NAP ministry around the role that rest plays. Not just for, I'm tired, I need to rest, but resting, our mind and building those neural pathways that happen when we are rested allows for a level of creativity and innovation that cannot exist when we are exhausted. Mm-hmm. And so that was another piece, like as I'm starting to understand some of those core tenements around in the NAP ministry around rest as reparations, rest as resistance, really, again, starting to understand the historical context that necessitates the need for us to rest. And again, being responsive to, in the reimagining space, do we want to reimagine the conditions of the existing dominant culture, the dominant culture around perfectionism, around a sense of urgency. We know these things will it took generations to get here. It's going to take generations to get us out, right? And so this expectation around sense of urgency, that's not something we can necessarily bring into this reimagined space, or do we want to bring it in to the reimagined space? And so, again, when I think about these ideas around care, I like what the NAP ministry says around moving away from self-care, which kind of ties to that rugged individualism, right, to this community care. As well as the soul care, recognizing that I am more than my physical body, which sometimes that self-care tends to default to the physical body. So again, I love that soul connection, as well as that community, because I'm only as healthy as my community, right? That one droplet of water is only as healthy as the rest of the ocean. Mm. And so always being mindful about strategically connecting those two is critical.
That's powerful. It reminds me of an interview I did with Akaya Windwood, the former president and CEO of Rockwood Leadership Institute, where she said something very similar about self-care being more about the individual, but really needs to take it, like care needs to take into context the community and the we versus the I. And so Absolutely. Your point is really resonant and in alignment with the comment that she had made. So you've done a lot. You mentioned the Freedom Schools. You've talked about some of your volunteer work, your work with AIR. I am wondering, as you look back on your career and all of those milestones, if there was a soundtrack of greatest hits that parallels or tracks with your career to date, what songs would make the list?
The first song that comes to mind is Mary, Mary. Get the shackles off my feet so I can dance. I listen to a lot of gospel music. I just feel like, again, makes that soul connection back to a power greater than myself. It reminds me, I even love Lift Every Voice and Sing. That song in and of itself, that poem that was turned into a song, obviously, really resonates with me. And it's funny because I think about it often when I'm tasked with doing either the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem. I always kind of default in my mind back to Lift Every Voice and Sing. And again, when you think about the end there, let us march on till victory is won. That's it. So when I hear this is hard or this is uncomfortable, oh, okay. We're marching on. Marching is hard. It's not like hanging out. It's not floating to victory. It's marching to victory. And that's a one step at a time. So I would say, the shackles off my feet so I can dance and lift every voice and sing.
Awesome. So in this conversation, you have referenced kind of in a meta sense, your grandfather, ancestors, like the lineage. I'm curious how you would describe the type of ancestor that you want to be.
I love this question because one of the questions I've been asking for my opening activities sometimes with that I again got from the good folks at 350, or actually did I get that from people of the global majority. Either way, good folks doing good work out there. But they asked me once, what characteristic or trait did I gain from my ancestors to contribute to whatever the project or program we were doing? And that was my first time really thinking at that individual ancestral level, as opposed to the kind of aggregate Black people legacy. So again, I love this one because it kind of extends that onward. One, grace and humility in this work. I try very hard to be explicit about my failures and missteps. Again, to push it back against the perfectionism. The disease of perfectionism, recognizing, even Martin Luther King and, so many others. I look at Nina Simone's life's work and am reminded of the necessary missteps in order to progress. Oftentimes, I think there is a fear, and going back to that reimagining space, there's a real fear around getting that wrong. We're just not going to get it right. Do you want to be right or do you want to live? Do you want to have a life, right? Because too often we're caught in semantics. And so I really am pushing for, just a larger conversation. And so hopefully, I'm walking the talk as it relates to the role of failure, the role of doubt, the role of uncertainty, the necessary role to move forward. I think another big piece that again, the finger I point at three other people are three back at myself, is around the intersection. So recognizing that, a focus on education requires a focus on health, education, environment. They're all connected. And so how can we be more intentional about multi-sector approaches? I hope another legacy that it's all connected.
Yeah. Well, I think you're demonstrating that through your touch points with education, workforce, health, the environment. Seems like there's a real bouquet, I guess, a real bouquet of the different areas that you're touching and bringing that grace and humility to. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, because you see that in the land too. I mean, I think Mother Nature, our planet, is a wonderful teacher, can be a wonderful mentor to us. And when you look out into the land, that's what you see. You don't see and when you see mono crops, for example, now we can see how damaging that is to the planet when you have a monocrop or when you're always in production. The land cannot handle that. And so it reacts, it responds, whether it be in large forest fires or air quality, et cetera. And so, again, I'm just trying to model what has been modeled to me by the universe and really trying to align to universal principles, the universe, as opposed to structures and frameworks that were really designed to oppress my ancestors and people who look like me today.
Yeah. So 2 more questions for you. Okay. One of them, which I feel like you've already done this through just the examples that you've given and the stories that you've shared with me thus far, but what advice would you offer to Black women who are trying to develop their voices and become better self-advocates?
Mentorship. Right? And reciprocal mentorship is what I would recommend highly. I recently got into a reciprocal mentorship relationship. It was my first intentional reciprocal relationship with an elder. And it was their idea. I went to them saying, I would really love mentorship because, again, I feel like we are so disconnected that finding community with other Black women has really been pivotal for me in my work. I think, again, entering the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School, there was already this beautiful network and infrastructure of Black women that were from all over the country, different content expertise, different geographies, different lived experiences, but there was a Blackness that bound us and a womanhood that bound us, and that is a unique intersection in and of itself. So, and along the intergenerational spectrum as well, or the generational spectrum as well, oftentimes I feel like young women kind of have mentorship from one area, it might be education related or after school related, but it's disconnected from, the larger community of Black women. And so, plugging in where it exists or forming community where it doesn't exist is something that I would highly recommend. Intergenerational is another component I would recommend. And it's there, right? I think the Great Pause has created more virtual connection opportunities. That previously didn't happen before. Again, obviously, technology is an access issue. Bandwidth is another access issue. But I think the platforms are there, and those accessibility barriers are starting to come down again. It depends on where you are, but I think that has been absolutely a critical part of my own growth, is having someone or someone's in my inner circle, Black women, to not only help me, but also, again, that I can help them, and recognize that we each bring value. And that value can look different. And that's why even, when we think about, well, what do I do for a living? It's like, well, how do you contribute to the world? Right? Like, your value is not attached to how much money you make. Your value, again, that's a value proposition. To me, it's about the impact that your work has on the world. And so, again, having that, but I didn't come to that by myself, right? I came to that in community with other Black women who were who helped me, rather, to be able to make that distinction.
Yeah. Reciprocal mentorship. I'm going to make note of that.
I think that's really huge.
That as well.
And the other thing is, I'm really coming to this, and is that I am not going to solve every problem by myself. That's the other thing. Is
the humility.
Like we take on so much, and I struggle with asking for help. I really, really struggle with it. I think a part of it is going back to that, as a Black woman, that superwoman, Black woman thing, which is not good for us in some ways, and Black girl magic is great in other ways. So too, do I feel like Black women in particular, I look at these new roles around diversity, equity, inclusion, chief diversity, tends to be Black women, and they're being put in roles that are above and beyond what anybody has ever been able to accomplish in those roles. And so how do we make sure that those women in particular can sustain, can have that container, have the community and soul care to be able to sustain those efforts? And do they have the supports needed? A title is nothing without responsibility and authority, without transparency and accountability. And so that's another area there, and that amplifying the voices, making sure that, how do you distribute leadership? How do you create leadership pipelines? We're not alone here. And recognizing, where is the role of Black men? Again, I know I'm focused on Black peoples, but again, in all of the different intersections, it's important to have a focus area. And anybody who knows me knows I'm also very committed to liberation for all peoples. So wanted to kind of make that plug.
Okay, so final question. We're going to zoom out just a little bit for a question about the social sector, so foundations and nonprofits. So if you had a magic wand and you could just make some change happen, presto, magnifico, what change would you make to the social sector that would benefit or affirm Black women?
So we know that Black women who are leading organizations in the nonprofit space receive less funding from foundations than their white counterparts doing the exact same type of work. They receive less money with more strings, right? And so as far as low-hanging fruit, that's one. It's just revisiting on the foundation side, what are the barriers as far as the application process, the recruitment process, the reporting process sometimes, and I've noticed a lot of foundations doing some great work there. I think that can continue on. I also wonder, on that larger scale, the first things that come to mind to me are reparations, right? How are these foundations really confronting and discussing and having conversations around reparations? operations. And by that, I mean, are there prioritizing levels as far as the the foundation cycles are concerned to the different communities being conserved? And then what I talked about earlier around those pathways, how are both, if I were to make one change, at a harder level is creating more Black women, or creating space for more Black women at the board, at the most important decision-making places in the organization, whether that be the foundation or the nonprofit sector. Do you see Black women there? If not, change it. I mean, what is the plan, right? Because going back to the environmental section, Dr. Taylor over at Yale, well, she'll be at Yale, she's at Michigan now, but heading over to Yale, which is wonderful to be a professor there in their School of Forestry and Management. She has been talking about diversifying the nonprofit environmental sector explicitly in her work since 2014, provided recommendations, everything. I'm coming into the space on my commission and outdoor Afro side, and I'm saying, well, where are the inroads that have been made since then? I mean, people are acting as if we haven't had these conversations before, and we have. So acknowledging that it is not a lack of information, it is not a lack of an evidence base, it is a lack of will. Do we have the will to step up? I see something, it's not working, I'm going to step up, I'm going to say something, step aside. Oh, I see that there's no Black people in this room. I'm going to step aside and invite in other voices that are disproportionately represented in the decision-making table. And then the last, my favorite, is step down. I mean, we see that Serena's husband stepped down and said, fill my spot with a Black person. So again, there are examples, there are approaches, there is an evidence base. What we lack is the will. Do we have the will to do what is necessary to right the wrongs of the past? And not only right the wrongs of the past, but build a future that we have never even seen before, both as a country and as a globe.
Mm. Preach on, preach on.
Right.
I would just say, let us march on. Thank you so much for making time for me from beautiful Boulder.
My pleasure.
I send you good wishes and good vibes as we navigate this current reality.
Indeed, indeed. And again, I was reminded that the Chinese character for for crisis is danger and opportunity. Right? How do you harness that? How do we reimagine in that opportunity space and not just reform? That's the challenge.
Great.
So
well, thank you so much.
Opportunity.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Take care.